We're apparently gonna have to deal with this shadow behind me. I wanted to pose a question as I was thinking about this net neutrality saga that we've had over the last, I'd say, year, but mostly couple of weeks as I focused more on it in my content. And I noticed a recurring theme of people going and saying, I had never heard of this beforehand. I had no idea about it. This was something I was completely unaware of. There are those that admitted that, and there's nothing wrong with knowing you don't know something. I think that's actually the first part of learning. But as I explained to them what, as best I could, what net neutrality was, I thought to myself, in an era where people have the ability to go online, type in the name of a person or some particular thing, whether it's a skill or an attribute or a definition of a word, why does it take having to ask really anyone much about anything at this point? And really, my reasoning is this. If you type in how to tie a tie, you'll get how to tie a tie. If you type in how to fish, you'll get how to fish. Now, granted, those things can only go so far. You have to practice it, but the gist is that you can see a person demonstrate something in a manner that you weren't able to in the past. And oftentimes we get so convinced that if we just have a person we like or know break it down for us or dumb it down for us, that's going to make it better. Um, and there have been cases where that's, I guess, worked, but it doesn't go along with the narrative that because of our technological advancements we're better off. I think we're worse off in not necessarily doing something from the past, but continuing to perpetuate a system that doesn't need to be in place anymore. You don't have to ask people what historically something is about when you can go online and look it up. And one can make the argument that this is it shouldn't take that much effort to explain something if you know a particular thing, and that is true. But also, you really have to look at it this way. Back in the 40s and 50s, or just any decade prior to the advancement of computers, if you wanted to learn something about anything, you had to go get a book, you had to go meet with a person that knew how to do it. There were just various communications and social skills required to interact when it came to the intake of knowledge. In this current era, all you have to do is type something in. You literally can sit in the room. I sat in one room and just read up all these various things about politics that spanned several decades. I'm not saying I'm some aficionado on it, but I know for a fact that I learned things I couldn't have learned without traveling around to a library or to get some novel. And I'm glad Maji Bad is agreeing with me. And really, this is kind of what was the crux of me having a deliberance in wanting to do the historical abridging videos, where it was a proposal I laid out a couple of days ago that I would take a topic like a war or a biography of a person and sum it up in a couple of sentences, maybe 2, 3, 4 minutes, in a manner that was scripted, but also tried to not necessarily copy what we've seen in the past with people who do those, learn something in a minute videos. And it became so irritating to think, if you do these, the people who will likely see them are those who already would have been curious anyway. And the people who don't want to see it or don't know anything about it will just more than likely click it off. And it's so aggravating to think people in this current era have never been more blessed with the technology and the equipment and just the wherewithal to go and look things up and learn something in a very short amount of time. And it's as though in having that ability and just it being an option, they continuously ignore it in favor of something else. I like to listen to music just as anyone else does. I like to watch various things on anywhere, YouTube or on TV, just like anyone else does. But when you have a world that is just so vast in what you can learn, forget about history. Even though I think everything comes down to history because everything starts with a background or some prior purpose. We don't just come up with ideas out of nowhere without having some context. But nonetheless, even if you didn't want to do that, why not learn how to acquire some new skill or maybe some legal practices? Brace Inc. says people seek acceptance more than knowledge. It appears that's the case. Um, but you have to understand where that's disturbing and really why we have to. And see, this is kind of the thing. People, I think there are a couple of facets, and I'll say hello to C Lab. You have some that want to learn things but never get around to them. I've been that way for a couple of times. You know, I feel that I'm up to par with a good chunk of American history. I want to kind of move into some other countries. And sometimes I keep delaying. I go, oh, okay, I'll get to it next week. I'll get to it next month. I'll get to it eventually. And it never happens because you keep saying to yourself, you have this unlimited amount of time to go and learn things, or it's not important enough to prioritize to where you do effectively start trying to comprehend it. I've done that in the past, and I know what it's like to think you're in this perpetual system where, oh, if I just don't know it, it's not going to make any difference except for my own knowledge, and so I can just get around with not knowing it. Broad Vulture, hello, how are you doing? But think about it. If you have no incentive to learn something beyond the basic interest, you're not going to learn it. When I became, I guess, politically aware, I said to myself, you know, I'm tired of watching these various videos, whether it's by TYT or Shapiro or someone else, and they talk about these things I don't know about. They're talking about these people I barely know about. Let me go and read up, some biographies online. Let me just check this stuff out. And that only happened because I kept staying on it. A lot of people, when they want to learn something, especially depending on the length of that thing, don't learn it, not because they're dumb or they're not intelligent, because they can't think to themselves, in a long-term scenario, I'm going to keep gaining knowledge on these things. They don't think that. They become convinced that what they are now is the best they're ever going to be when it comes to their grasp and scope of knowledge. So they just say, well, the really smart people will know these things, I'll just know these things. Sometimes I felt that way. Sometimes when I learn about, I don't know, sports players, and I go, well, the really active sports fan will know that thing, and I'll just know my political stuff. And I don't like to be that way. If something can be learned, there's a merit and purpose to it, why not try to understand it at the very least? I'm not going to stick my fingers in my ears and go, no, 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 because I don't believe that does anything to address the problem of people not necessarily figuring things out. Okay, so C-Lab says, same here. I was so done with not knowing what anyone on the news or in videos was talking about. Exactly, but see, C-Lab, you also have to note this. You were given an incentive because you felt oblivious to things people were speaking about. I felt the same way. But you also found that higher value, because no one learns something just so they can be better than someone. I didn't learn things about history so I could say, ha ha, I can tell you more about the Gulf War. It never was that. You do it because you have an interest, and your interest typically is from wanting to see yourself be that person that when they make a reference to some events from 20, 30, 40 years ago, you can say, okay, well, I know the bare minimum about that. So, for example, even though I couldn't give you a breakdown of every single battle that was in World War II, I could still say it was fought between the Allies and the Axis, started with the invasion of Poland, the various leaders on both sides, I could tell you that. My point in saying this is that we're not, and this is another thing, people think you have to learn every single detail about some stuff to be an expert. You don't. You just, knowing the bare minimum is in some cases fine enough, because you're not going to get those who are dedicated to certain topics that often. You're not going to get someone who's, so dedicated to sports that they go and look up the name of every single player that's ever been on, I don't know, the Rams or something to that effect. They're not going to do that. You're not going to get someone who's so into politics that they go and look up every senator from their state or governor from their state. There is a certain level we all cut off at. And sometimes that's due to a lack of information being available about those periods. And sometimes it's just due to us not feeling the need to go back and just bury ourselves in all this information. But I hope the topic made some sense. Um, leave a comment if you want to. I'm just kind of amazed by the idea that we'll have these phones, these computers, and these other forms of technology that you can use to discover and grasp things, and people just won't take advantage of it. Bro Vulture says, when I want to learn, having to know everything about it makes me want to not try. So yeah, bare minimum is good, but you need to know what is bare. Well, I just gave you an example of World War II. I gave you that it was there's millions of people died. Starts with invasion of Poland. No, when it starts, it ends. Maybe a brief sentence about the major battles. Know the two factions who fought were. There you go. It's this stuff. It can seem difficult on paper, but if you actually try and read these things and summarize it or get someone to summarize it, it's not that difficult. Self-taught. Um, I'm telling you, the internet. I used it, and I get a lot of flack over some other comments I've made on here, but I have, in my view, used the internet to its fullest capability when it comes to learning things. I think I've taken advantage of that tenfold. Um, because there were many things I felt lacking from the education system I grew up in, whether it was the skimming over of major world events or just not paying attention to them for that long. I had a history book that said MLK gave his "I Have a Dream" speech. 5 years later, MLK was assassinated. It gave you this, not even the bare minimum, just below that. It's giving me a half of a fifth of what they should be telling me about certain leaders, and in that case, MLK. So it was things such as that really propelled me to go and check these things out 3 years ago. Um, so I want that to be known. Anyways, thank you for watching. I'll have something else out definitely tomorrow, maybe today. We'll see.